My title John gave me is Glycemic Response and Index and Load for Weight Management. So what I will do is give some thoughts about it. Becoming older, on one hand, you become a little bit more milder, but on the other hand, you also can do some more bold statements because you are not anymore that directly in the field. So let's see. So this is my disclosure. Nothing receive any financial support related to the program. I have some connections with pharma and especially also to food industry, especially donating food products for the intervention studies we do, some speaker honoraria and things like that. And related to this presentation, all of the results were published in peer-reviewed journals. Can I have it also on that screen? So let's start with some physiological arguments why glycemic index is of importance related to body weight management, and especially low glycemic index. So, and this type of research was done already, let's say 20 years ago, most of it, and I will give you just a couple of examples. First of all, increase in insulin sensitivity and also free fatty acid levels by minimizing glucose fluctuation over the day. And this is an example from Bente Keynes from Copenhagen, which gives you very nice that with a high glycemic index you give these high rise in glucose, and what is more important, I think, is that it also gives a shutdown of fatty acid oxidation, and that is maybe the most important part related to body weight management. Second is, of course, increase in 24-hour oxidation, and this is an example from Fabrio in 2000, showing very clearly over 24 hours that you can get, with a low glycemic index diet over that day, you get an increase in fat oxidation and a decrease in glucose and especially glycogen oxidation, which is of importance for long-term weight management because we know that obese subjects has an impaired fat oxidation. And then the next one is, of course, a very important one, increase satiety and lower food intake, and this is from the group of Jennie, already done in 1995, showing clearly that with a low glycemic diet, you have an increase in satiety over the day, but what is more important, you see also a decrease in energy intake during, and this is, I think it was a couple of hours later, if I remember well, from the paper. But a lot of other papers also showed that with low glycemic food you have a higher satiety and therefore lower food intake. And then finally there is also the argument, some people say that you have an increase in diet-induced thermogenesis, and we did a study a long time ago and we didn't show any difference in relation to starch in this respect compared to glucose, fructose or sucrose. So I don't think that is a very important factor related to physiology and weight management. But the big question is, of course, does it work in real life? And that means that you can see a lot of data in the literature where short-term, and I like the paper from Anna Raben, who reviewed in 2000, 2002 most of the studies at that time. You can see there are a lot of short-term studies up to 1-2 weeks. There are longer-term studies up to half a year, 6 months. And then we have some prospective epidemiological studies. And what you can see here, and I will not go in detail, that 50% say yes, there is a positive effect, and 50% say no, there is no effect. But there are a number of problems with these type of studies. For instance, there are a number of isoenergetic studies, and I don't think these are the best studies to do if you want to look at body weight regulation on the long term. I think the only one which really holds value for evaluation is the ad libitum studies, because that is what happened in real life. And also, of course, in the energy restriction studies, there the purpose is to lose weight. So this is not really weight control, weight management on the long term in respect to see what is going on. So the question is, how valid are these type of studies? I think if you talk about weight management, you should have at least studies of minimal 3 to 6 months, and preferable 6 months to a year. And if you talk about daily life, you have to do it in ad libitum situation, because all the other ones are more or less restricted, and of course you have an effect on energy intake, and therefore you have also an effect on body weight, but that is not what you like to look when you advise people to have a low glycemic diet or not. And finally, and now comes the bold statement, should we not abandon food intake data as a result, especially when it comes from unhealthy items like fat and sugary foods? I'm a believer that we should abandon all this type of questionnaires on food intake, because we cannot trust people anymore what they are saying, because they know now for 50 years exactly what they have to say about what is healthy and unhealthy. And I like this slide from Livesey, where they did an analysis of, I think, 60, 70 studies. And he also tabulated the studies on type of studies. And here you can see the ad libitum, food intake. And this is going this way, is a lower glycemic index. And here you see the difference in energy intake. And you see clearly that with ad libitum food intake, there is an effect of low glycemic food. What you expect also based on the physiological data. If you have controlled food intake, there is no difference in energy intake. So again, this is a good example that for measuring or for looking into the effect of glycemic index in the real daily life situation, you have to do it with ad libitum food studies. Prospective studies and food intake data, what I said before, what and who should we believe? And I think I recommend you to read this paper. It's from the Energy Measuring Working Group, and especially David Ellison was the initiator of this. And the title is Energy Balance Measurement When Something is Not Better Than Nothing. And in fact, it's a good argument why we should not ask people what they are eating and what is the energy intake, but we really should do measurements in order to get better effects and better objective measurements of food intake. And of course, I know it's very difficult, but we have to focus in this respect, because food intake data is becoming more and more unreliable. So the alternatives is measuring biomarkers of food intake and energy expenditure, and the doubly layered water is a good example. Controlled intervention trials using new technologies like the supermarket model I will show you. And I think we should focus much more on food production data corrected for waste, because that type of data, especially when we are interested in trends, I think these data is much more reliable than looking in NHANES and see what people are saying what they eat. Diet and body weight management in general. I like this paper published beginning of this year or end of last year in JAMA, where they compare different weight loss or healthy diet program in overweight and obese adults. It was a meta-analysis, and there was an editorial which says, in fact, the conclusion of this meta-analysis, a diet by any other names is still about energy. And that is where it goes about. So we have to focus on energy and whether or not glycemic index will have an effect on that. Because this meta-analysis showed clearly that from all these different diets that they analyzed, the studies published about that the Atkins diets with a very high fat diet and the Ornish diets with a very low fat diet were the most successful one. So macronutrient is not of importance, it's only about energy. And that means that we have to look how macronutrients can link to energy intake under an ad-lib situation. And I think we should start with that, and in fact yesterday it was also said already, that we should start with fat, because it is a high density type of macronutrient, and we have now a number of studies and meta-analysis, and this is one of them we did with Arne Astrup, showing very clearly that, again, in an ad-lib situation, ask people to eat less fat, they lose weight, and in this case it is about 2.8 kilograms. Voluntarily, not asking people, this is a weight loss program, no, just saying we are focusing on fat in relation to cardiovascular health or whatever, and automatically they voluntarily also lose some weight, 3 kilograms. So the next question is then, if you lower energy coming from fat, then of course intake from carbohydrates goes up, and what type of carbohydrates are of importance. And this was in fact the start of the CARMEN study we did in Europe end of the 90s. It was a European Commission funded study in 5 centers all over Europe, and this was a long-term multi-center randomized control parallel comparison of 400 overweight to obese subjects to study the effect of an ad libitum, and that is an important ad libitum reduction of 10% of fat intake, and we didn't focus at all at weight and say that this diet was more related to cardiovascular health and things like that. And at the same time we said, okay, we also look for the carbohydrate quality, and in that respect we didn't talk about low or high glycemic index. Sorry, Jennie and David. At that time I was not a believer of the glycemic index. That was on one side. The other side was that it was very difficult at that time to look for in food tables which was a low or a high glycemic food. And because we did it in a controlled situation in the supermarket, we needed to have clear information about glycemic index, and therefore we use, which is well known tabulated in food tables, the simple or complex carbohydrates, which is maybe, I'm not sure, but I think it is a good proxy also for low and high glycemic food. And here you see some of the examples. We started in that study for the first time, and we did already some before in Maastricht, where you provide all the food to subjects for 6 months, and you provide, say, you only can shop in this shelf, which is low fat type of products compared to the similar type of products, which is normal fat, or simple carbohydrates, or complex carbohydrates. And you can see on the bottom also that we did for the Diogenes study, which I will show later, we did that for the whole family. And we barcode everything. So this is a very controlled, semi-controlled way, because they are still able to go their own to the supermarkets to buy their own favorites, and alcohol of course. But at least you push them in a certain direction of low glycemic or high glycemic food. It's also quite complex, and I admire now more supervisors of supermarkets, because it's a hell of a job to get things on time and fresh in particular. So this was the outcome, and you see clearly you have the SCHO, that's the simple carbohydrate group, and the complex carbohydrate group, and the control group, and you see that if you look to the fat mass, there is a decrease in fat mass of about 1.4 to nearly 2 kilograms in both groups with a lower fat intake, because they had a decrease of 10% coming from fat. And in one case it went up with the simple carbohydrate, and the other case it went up with the complex carbohydrate, but in both cases they lose significantly more body weight and body fat compared to the control group. There were no significant difference between the simple and complex, although there was a tendency that the complex was losing more weight than the simple. But I think the 400 people were not enough to make it statistically significant. Now, based on that, a couple of years after, I was thinking about, okay, we now know that fat is of importance. We have an idea about carbohydrate type, more in the direction of unrefined or low glycemic versus high glycemic. And at that time also protein came into the picture as an important factor. So that was for me the idea to start a new European project, which was the Diogenes project. And in this case we focused on low fat intake, still low fat intake, but then increase a little bit more in protein or in low glycemic food. And with the help of Jennie in particular, because it was still a hell of a job to rank all the breads all over Europe related to glycemic index, but she helps us very much in that respect to make it possible. And you can see that we use a model which we are used already for 20 years in Maastricht, that people lose weight, and then we randomize them into different groups and see what is the weight regain, because this is a period of that people are very vulnerable for gaining weight. And of course, it is not exactly the same like weight gain in a long-term situation, but then you have to wait for 1-2 years, and that is impossible to do this type of studies. For this is in the weight regain phase, after they lost about 11 kilograms of body weight, the whole group, and in this way you can see that you are able to look in the period time window of about 6 months to see what is the weight doing with the high protein, low protein, or high glycemic, low glycemic. And the outcome, you know, this was published a couple of years ago. You can see clearly that the high protein, low glycemic group is the one who really kept off all the weight, so the 11 kilograms over this 6 months period. And you can see that the increase in protein was about 5 energy%, which is not that much. So you can do that in a normal situation. And also the reduction in glycemic index was about 5 units, which is again not a very dramatic change in diet if you want to have a more lower glycemic food. We also look in 2 centers, Copenhagen and Maastricht, the outcome after 1 year. All the people in that 2 centers, because they used also the supermarket system. And we saw after 1 year that the protein effect was still significant, but the low glycemic index effect was disappeared. At least it was not longer significant. And of course, the number of people were smaller, was about 120 people, but it also gives an idea that if you talk about influence of macronutrients, I think both have an effect, most probably protein a little bit more than glycemic index, low glycemic index. Now, what has happened in the last 10 years related to meta-analysis, because we are now depending completely on meta-analysis to make conclusions out of things. There are now 2 available. There was the Cochrane review from Thomas Elliott and Bauer, which was in 2007. And there was one published a little bit more than 1 year ago by Hoffman, Swingsaki, and Hoffman. And you can see in the first one there were 6 randomized controlled trials included from 5 weeks to 6 months, which to my opinion is not very valid to do that, especially the shorter ones. And there were only 3 randomized controlled trials at lib, low versus high, and another one ad lib, low versus energy restricted. So in fact you can throw away this one, because this is not really something to look at if you want to have an effect of glycemic index in the daily life situation. And again, the other one, the systematic review from 2013, there were about 2,500 subjects involved. This was from half a year up to 1.5 years, so that looks a little bit more better. And there were 5 randomized controlled trials at lib, low versus high, and also 2 about low versus high glycemic load. Now the outcome in the forest plot, I don't think you can see it very well in the back, but at least what is of importance that in the first one from 2007 there was about 1 kilogram lowering body weight with a low glycemic index, and in the latest analysis you see it was 0.6 kilogram body weight, which sounds to me logic if you look the results from the Diogenet project, that it has an effect, but it is at least certainly smaller than for fat, and maybe also a little bit smaller than for protein. Now, this is my last slide, and I adapted this from Dave Mila, who is using that already for a couple of years, showing what are the important issues related to diet in relation to body weight management. And of course, there are a number of factors which we didn't talk about today, but I think, and I also adapted a little bit to my own experience and ideas. Energy content and portion size are the most important ones. And energy content is directly related to fat content. So despite the fact that a lot of people are saying fat is not of importance, it is sugar in the diet, I don't believe them. It is still fat who makes the difference, especially in relation to ad libitum, in the real life situation related to body weight gain. Then volume, especially on viscosity, solid versus liquid. We didn't talk about that. Then I think protein intake is of importance. Glycemic index is coming up, and then carbohydrate type and fat type. I don't think it is really of importance related to body weight regulation on the long term. Thank you for your attention.
I was required to spell this out loud. I have no financial, any commercial conflicts, though I have clearly intellectual conflict of interest. And listed here is some of the papers that I have written, as well as I have read and influenced my own thinkings for some times. The last two papers that I did with Dr. Wolever for the medical textbooks of up-to-date, literally on the issue of dietary carbohydrate related to health outcomes, have been updated for the past 10 years. And you know, I can tell you the royalty I get from that, it's more than any books, chapters I have ever written. In terms of my degrading up to 20 years studying nutrition and health, I take the view that all clinical outcomes of significance are due to interactions, gene-diet interaction particularly. And I don't hang out with the nutrition cow for the past 10 years or so because I have moved into the genetic area. I therefore take the stand that all foods are nutritious and all nutritional concepts good, be it South Beach diet or the old post-hormone replacement diet, anti-androgen pause diet and whatnot, the zone diet, they're all good. It really depends on the circumstances and places and times within which one consumes them. So I attempt to embrace all good nutritional ideas and concepts with gratitude, including the glycemic index, which I thank both David and Jennie for teaching me when I was doing my graduate work at Harvard, and let go of them with grace. In fact, this is shared with those of you who come up with new nutritional concepts, and don't get too uptight about it, and enjoy foods freely in my pursuit of happiness with family and friends. I tend to be very intense in doing my talks as well as my own works. So, you know, to lessen my intensities, I pray with my 2-year-old daughters, Callie, who is a golden retriever, who consume essentially any foods faster than you imagine. So with that, I can end my talk here. Okay, so to set that in context, and roughly about 15 or so years ago, then when or literally 20 years ago, when we started to look at these issues of the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes and coronary events, when we look at a list of really shared risk factors for type 2 diabetes, it becomes very clear to us that there's some common pathways that not only by which not only diet but also genetic influence clearly dictates the risk that on the one hand can reduce glucose recognitions, impair insulin action as well as secretions, then leads to the development of type 2 diabetes, but also the underlying insulin resistance clearly have two fundamental features, which is hyperglycemia as well as hyperinsulinemia. Although once one becomes an adult, it is extremely difficult to determine which one is the chicken and which one is the egg. But suffice it to say that really captured the entire, in one single slide, the entire understanding of the pathogenesis or pathophysiologies of both type 2 diabetes and coronary events, particularly in relation to dyslipidemia, hypertension, and hemodynamic changes that ultimately causes MIs. Now, one can devote one's entire career to take a glycemic view, and that's essentially what we're trying to look at this and take it as simple a manner as possible to do a meta-analysis. Though we do it the kind of meta-analysis we do, we call it dose-response meta-analysis. Essentially, is lining up all the data all the publications ever reported, looking at simple measures of blood glucose, both fasting as well as postprandial, in relation to cardiovascular events, and you see this kind of pictures. Obviously, you know that most folks with type 2 diabetes eventually die of coronary events. Anywhere between 80% or more succumb to heart disease. But for the people who are without apparently clinical phenotypes of type 2 diabetes, whether or not the relationship is linear is not clear. But by and large, if you fit to regression line, we see this kind of relationship. And this is also so important. This is essentially a meta-analysis was done over a decade ago. And since then, there's more studies. It essentially just put more dots into this picture. And one single study really cannot change the whole picture. And once we really take the cumulative view, and I would argue that the relationship has actually become stronger now. And now, in fact, this is the paper by Michael Brownlee, published also in Nature back in 2001, where he summarized some of the pathological mechanisms by which hyperglycemia induced mitochondrial superoxide overproduction. In his view, activated 4 pathways of hyperglycemia damage directly to the endothelial cells, and this is in his own view, summarizing the mechanistic data, literally decades of data, and why hyperglycemic diet or hyperglycemia can have this kind of vascular damage. Now, it is actually very straightforward to me, at least, that if you think that the glycemia is not good, then postprandial glycemia can be dealt with primarily by 2 means. One is pharmacological, another one is diet. Now, pharmacologically, in fact, we do have a drug that would delay gastrointestinal absorption of carbohydrate, and this is the so-called arcabols, which is a alpha-glucosidase inhibitors. And this is the trial that have directly shown its clinical efficacies by reducing risk of type 2 diabetes in a completely randomized intervention settings. And this is the same trial looking at clinical endpoints for coronary events and cardiovascular events, though the sample size is small, but the trend is very clear. Now, this is the therapeutic paradigms of looking at this, and I can sort of like set up another lecture. In fact, in my own lectures, both at Harvard, UCLA, and then now at Brown, I always argue to my students that thinking along the paradigms of therapeutic or drug paradigms of evaluating prevention using diet and nutrition is a wrong paradigm. So randomized control trial oftentimes are very misleading because you are comparing apple and oranges, and diet is so complex. And let me explain to you why, just very quickly in my talk. And And one should really look at, as a result, the totality of evidence across different study designs as well as different layer or systems of comparisons. This is a paper published also back in, essentially last centuries now. In fact, majority of this slide that I'm going to use is also from last centuries, just to show that this has been around, and a lot of the arguments or criticisms really rehearse of the old criticisms. And glycemic response curves look like this, which is really ideal if you want. I think that's really the genius of David and Tom and his colleagues, and we come up with a simple index that would reduce within person variation while highlight the between person variations of glycemic response due to foods. And particularly for those of you, those guys who are not quantitatively oriented, this is actually a billion simple touch of genius. Why? I kind of explain it in such a manner because as an epidemiologist, we often call ourselves the black box approach, right? We use the black box approach. We don't know what you tell me, what you eat, we don't know what's happening inside your body, but we just count heads, how many of you actually develop certain disease, and then really compare. It's a very dumb way of doing business, but yet it's actually quite powerful in counting which one is good and which one is best. There's many things, again, happening in a diet that would affect the eventual outcome, and we basically, all the way through the food production process, the digestibilities of carbohydrate. In fact, you heard earlier today about resistant starch and whatnot. But then actually, in vivoli, you can also pick up just by a simple method or simple biomarkers to get at the potential physiological effects of the diet, and then you can incorporate it in your assessment. Now, why this is so good? Because we do know, at least if you want to study diet in even one single individuals, it is extremely complex. This is another paper, review papers published in Nature, essentially summarize all these nitty-gritty details and all these nuances related to the regulation of food intakes. And presumably, our brain is the central organ that processes the central signals that determine essentially the amount and the size and the frequencies of our food intakes or even particular food choice that one make. However, the signals, the peripheral signals such as glucose and also here even leptins, that protein that's secreted by the fat cells and eventually being cloned and signifying the entire molecular errors of medicines, essentially telling the brain what neuropeptides to be secreted and also either stimulate or inhibit food intakes. Now, because the systems are so redundant and oftentimes one is overriding the other, the whole thing is extremely complex. And we wanted to use a dietary assessment at the population level to assess them using be it food frequency questionnaire or 24-hour week course or dietary assessments. Oftentimes there will be errors. And that actually necessitates, not because that we shouldn't study it, but it is demands the kind of studies that needs to be prospective so that the errors won't be dependent. And also, we need to look at it in multiple tiers of association and look at its internal consistencies across the different type of studies. And if they are consistent, then arguments for causality would be strengthened. And that's exactly what we did. And we first looked at this in the US, the entire United States data maintained by USDAs, in fact, for over a century in terms of the disappearance data, looking at specifically the consumptions of refined carbohydrate, and then also the United States maintain national surveys every 10 years or so, where we can actually document, at least at the population level, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and whatnot. In fact, this is the paper I recall that David actually did a very nice editorial for AJCNs. In fact, we find that, if you look at those national data, this is so-called ecological analysis, taking a broader view, everything is positively associated with type 2 diabetes. Like if you read it here in terms of the R's for carbohydrate, it's 0.55, protein 0.71, fiber 0.16, and corn syrup 0.83. But then when you conduct the kind of multivariable nutrient density studies, that the two indicators that show up most consistently and also significantly is essentially fiber and high fructose corn syrup presented as the data. So now, just very quickly, I ran out of time, I need to fast. Okay, so, all right, so see, I know that I will not be able to present any data. You all know about glycemic index, and this is the data that I'm going to show. It's all published already. So this is supposedly for French sec to see, actually telling the clear. In fact, I should show this paper, this one first. It's essentially comparing the change in fasting triglyceride corresponding to change in percent energy from fat. Literally in a head-to-head analysis of metabolic experiments versus observational study. The observational study is primarily a couple that we have published in the Nurses' House study, looking at fasting triglyceride in response to, or just simply correlated to high carbohydrate diet. And the yellow line was showing a meta-analysis done by Martin Catan Scoop in Netherlands, showing a very good effect. I think, if anything, the slope that we observed in those postmenopausal women were actually presumably more insulin resistant. Anyway, so let's show very quickly, and this is a trial from Jerry Weaven's group from Stanford, showing essentially the response of a high carbo diet, presumably also high glycemic load, totally dependent on your underlying insulin resistant state of the body. With the more insulin resistant you have, the more likely you have the adverse response. Okay. This is the meta-analysis data showing sex-specific differences, and I indicated related to diabetes. This is Jeff Girard and I look at this data. Again, nurses' data looking at the coronary events by BMI in relation to dietary glycemic load, a clear doubling in risk in the groups with overweight and obesity to begin with. Anyway, this is another meta-analysis confirming that. This is the slide that I wanted to show to make you appreciate. Again, this is a control experiments in mice. We are essentially looking at 200 different kind of mice responded to this, giving to the same kind of diet, and see their total adipose tissue growth vary quite dramatically depending on whether the mouse is male or female. Okay, so well, I can just quickly show all those data and then come up with the conclusion essentially, which roughly 9 years ago at a WHO workshop done on behalf of the consensus panel of experts. So I think this is a fair conclusion based on still 10 years later of the data that I have read. It's the results from both metabolic and epidemiological study, primarily prospective cohort studies, still indicated that a diet characterized by high glycemic index adversely affect metabolic intermediates and may increase the risk of both diabetes and coronary events, especially among people who are prone to insulin resistance. Okay? All right, so to avoid misinterpretation, then we also should emphasize that that this concept not be used in isolation, and I think Sims also mentioned that. However, I do wanted to emphasize that incorporating glycemic index is indeed far better than the simple versus complex chemicals way of classifying carbohydrate. And in counting glycemic load is far better than counting carbohydrate for those need to dosing their insulin. So with that, I truly appreciate the invitation again. And
thank you, Simin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. These are the people who've given support to the meeting. And I have, from these particular ones, I've received some honorary consulting fees from General Mills and Abbott, and University of Toronto supports it, and I received my salary from the University of Toronto, so that's a conflict of interest. In terms of other disclosures, I don't have any relevant grant or research support. I've received Speakers Bureau's honorary consulting fees from these people. And my major one is that my wife and I are owners and employees of 2 contract research organizations, Glycemic Index Labs and GI Testing. And to mitigate this, I always declare my conflicts of interest. Neither my companies nor I own any intellectual property related to any of the research we do. And I have divested myself from all financial interest in any companies with whom I have received honoraria, with whom my company deals, or which we've done business with. So this is feedback. So what I hope to do today is review the differences between glycemic response, glycemic index, glycemic load. I want to review the effect of ethnicity on glycemic index. And we'll be comparing the precision of the original glycemic index methodology with the ISO method, which we have a recently published paper on that. So we've heard this morning that it's generally accepted that high glucose, high postprandial glucose is bad for you. So the question I want to ask is, how do we measure that? How do we quantify a glycemic response? How do we measure the effect? And this is particularly relevant if a company wants to make a product they wish to make a claim about. We need to have a way to talk about this in a proper way. And there are several terms that have been used, and we'll start with glycemic response. This is the one which I think today most people tend to favor, and this is defined by the DRI committee in 2005 of the effects of carbohydrate-containing foods on blood glucose concentration during the time course of digestion. And this is okay, but my problem with this is it's a very vague definition, and if we wish to compare the blood glucose concentrations between potato and barley, for example, this is 67 subjects from a multi-center trial, you can see that the barley could be called anywhere from 24% less to 13% higher than the potato, depending on which time you wish to choose. Many people feel that the rise in blood glucose is more relevant than the concentration, and then here we could have a difference as much as 90% almost lower. And other matrices which are used could be the peak concentration, which is 22%, the peak rise is 56% different, the total area under the curve, incremental area under the curve. These numbers vary tremendously. So basically you could make any claim you wish and just pick the right number, which doesn't seem to me very scientific or objective. So I think that's a problem with the glycemic response concept. If we could define it a little better, it's probably okay, but we haven't as yet. So the glycemic load we've heard a lot about. It was defined originally, as Simin said, GI times the grams of carbohydrate. And I think it's important to realize that in epidemiological studies, this concept was applied to the entire diet, and it's energy adjusted. So the evidence for the benefit of a glycemic load is an energy adjusted glycemic load calculation, which really doesn't necessarily apply to individual foods. This is better, all right? So what does this term mean? As Simin said, it's the glycemic response elicited by the glycemic load grams of glucose. So you can change this in two ways. You can change it by changing the glycemic index, or you can change it by changing the grams of carbohydrate. So the glycemic load of 2 apples is twice the glycemic load of 1 apple. And I think that's how we generally think about it, but this is not the way the evidence for it is presented. The evidence is presented as an energy adjustment, and per 1,000 calories, of course, these 2 servings of apple have the same glycemic load. So I think, for me, I find this very confusing, and I don't quite know how to interpret it. Of course, the other problem we have is how do we measure this if we're going to claim for it? And of course, you calculate it from the glycemic index. That's fine. We have to know how to measure the GI. We'll get to that in a minute. Many foods that would be low glycemic load, you can't actually measure their GI because they don't have enough carbohydrate. So here you have to directly determine the glycemic load. So for example, you could take a food and compare it to 50 grams of glucose. You compare serving the food, you get an AUC of 30. You read off the graph, you find the curve, the number is 15. But I think this is not in fact correct because the dose response curve for glucose is not linear, it's curved. And so, in fact, the glycemic load would actually be 10. And so if you're going to directly measure, you need to determine this dose response curve in the subjects across the range of carbohydrate that the serving of the product contains. And we've published on that, and it can be done very accurately. We can assess to 1 gram accuracy of carbohydrate for glycemic load. So glycemic index was the first metric of an index of carbohydrate effects on glycemic response, which we published in 1981. And it's based on controlling for the amount of available carbohydrate. And when I was at a meeting of the FAO Carbohydrate Committee in late 1990s, Hesty Voster said, we really should do an interlab study to see how good this measure is. So based on that, we did that. And I sent around foods, many of you probably know this, 5 foods to different labs around the world, 7 experienced labs, and most of the people are sitting here in the audience who participated in this study. And what we found, I was a little bit disappointed, that the between lab standard deviation, in other words, the means of the estimates of the foods from each lab, was about 9. I mean, I kind of hoped it might be a bit better. Other people have felt that was fairly large. And I thought, well, we had to cook all these foods. So what if I could do foods which just were, ready to eat? Because we know cooking could affect it. So the second interlab study, we sent 2 foods which were ready to eat, and I had 28 labs, and some of them were total novices. I had one from every continent in the world, which was really cool. I was very happy about that. Some of the novice labs did extremely well, and some of the very experienced labs did very badly. And they all know, but I won't say any more. But the answer was actually about the same. But we do know that different labs do have different precision, so that's something. So these data, people have used these studies to bring forth a number of criticisms. People have felt that this is quite inaccurate and rather imprecise. So the inaccuracy, in other words, the average, the mean is wrong, and then was suggested this might be affected by ethnicity. And in terms of imprecise, that standard deviation is a bit large, and the regulatory agencies have suggested we should perhaps use glycemic response instead, as being, I don't know why, they don't give a reason. So I just we've just done a systematic review of the meta-analysis of the effect of ethnicity on GI, and it's just been accepted for publication. We use kind of normal methods. We reviewed 430 trials. There are 8 studies, so this included 28 comparisons of foods among Caucasians and non-Caucasians. I put 585, but some of the studies had, of course, several foods, so the subjects are counted twice. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Here are the results. And overall, we found actually there was a small difference. The non-Caucasians had a slightly higher GI, not quite significant, just missed. It was 0.0, where are we at here? 0.06, significant heterogeneity. And when we looked at the data, it appeared that this heterogeneity was explained by rice, and a series of studies from New Zealand where they compared the GI of rice in Chinese versus Caucasian subjects, European, in quite large numbers, 30 in each, showed that the Chinese have a higher number, and this was associated with increased chewing. Chinese chewed the rice into smaller particles, which could explain why they had a higher GI. They'd be more rapidly digested. This study didn't show any. So if we took these out and just look at all the other studies, then there's no effect at all. There's a clear effect here driven by these studies. So we concluded here that, in fact, there isn't, with the possible exception of rice, there really isn't much difference with ethnicity in GI. Well, what about precision and the precision of glycemic response? Is this actually any better? Is this a better metric than GI? And of course, we can use our inter-lab study data to compare the glycemic responses of those foods. And just to pull it out, I compared the responses of the 4 foods to bread. And Health Canada, in a quite helpful suggestion, suggested that the AUC should be at least 20% lower compared to a reference food. So that's the kind of claim or the kind of data you'd have to present to make this kind of a claim, compare to some other food. And indeed, bread would be a very appropriate thing to compare potato rice spaghetti with. So here are the means and standard 95% confidence intervals, potato rice, spaghetti, barley for the glycemic index. For our labs, you can see for barley, all the labs have a lower, significantly lower GI than bread. Bread is 70, not shown, but they're there. Here is the percent differences of the labs, and you can see not all of the labs have a significantly lower. Barley is not significantly less than bread, 100% here. In fact, the mean standard deviation is significantly higher here. Of course, the means are higher, but if we use the coefficient of variation, we still have a significantly higher difference. So glycemic response is not going to be inherently better than glycemic index. Indeed, it could be worse in terms of precision, between lab precision. So the GI methodology has moved. We've had a lot of people have said there isn't a standard method. There is, in fact, a standard method, and we have now an ISO method. And the ISO method contains all of the same general procedures that we had in originally 1981, and that this was the method we used for the 2 inter-lab studies. The ISO method, though, includes a few more procedures and criteria which were intended to improve precision. Studies that we had done which demonstrated that you did improve accuracy and precision. Accuracy by excluding outliers, precision by suggesting the reference, the within individual variation of the repeated reference food has to be within a lower than a certain amount. Have to use at least 10 subjects, use 2 fasting samples, improves the accuracy, the precision of the AUC calculation, and your analytical method has to be accurate. And most glucometers, for example, are much higher CV than that. But we didn't actually know whether this actually was any better than the original method. And so recently, one of our clients did a study to look at this, and it was published, presented at the FASEB last April, and so I can show the results here. These are the 6 foods, and the 3 labs involved were our lab, GI Labs, Sydney, and a lab by Fortis in France. And these are the means and the 95% confidence intervals of the means for each lab for each of the 6 foods. You can see they go from high to low GI. You'll note that if they're low GI, their 95% confidence intervals do not overlap high in any case. In fact, the same goes if they're high, they don't overlap low. And the mean standard deviation is 4.7, which is a lot less than 9. However, you'll say, well, we don't know that these labs may be quite good labs. So is that really a fair comparison? And fortunately, these 3 labs participated in the second interlab study. And here are the means and standard deviations for the same labs for the two foods, and that average is 5.9. So that's a 20% difference, and if you use a CV, it's 30%, over 35% different. So this suggests that the new method is actually more precise the way it's supposed to be. It's performing better, perhaps. I wouldn't call this a definitive study, and I'd certainly like to see some more. But I would like to conclude that glycemic index yields more precise results than glycemic response, primarily because we repeat the reference food so we get a more representative value for what we're comparing against. You could do that for glycemic response if you wished. With the possible exception of rice, foods' GI values don't differ if they're measured in Caucasians and non-Caucasians. I think this is a very interesting observation and should be followed up. And certainly in Asia, and where rice is a food, this is an important issue. And I think that the current ISO method may be more precise than the original method. The mean between lab standard deviation is now down to 5, less than 5. Although I think we probably would like to have some more confirmation of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for an excellent, precise and accurate discussion.
My disclosures of commercial support, first and foremost, as Jenny mentioned, I work for the Glycemic Index Foundation, which is a not-for-profit health promotion charity, originally established by Diabetes Australia, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation of Australia, and the University of Sydney. So that's my primary conflict of interest, and they did help get me here. And some of the products I'm going to show in the presentation do carry our certification trademark, which of course is the subject of my talk. Secondly, I do speak a fair bit, and often I get paid for it, which is kind of nice. And there's a list of the ones that have paid for me over the last 5 years. And I, like a few of the other speakers, do have a few books that I've put together over the last few years. And if you're really interested, I can show you them in the break. As far as mitigating potential bias, is it better to go? Okay. I'm going to show that there's actually two methods of making GI claims on the labels of food. So I'll be showing both of those methods and results of research with respect to that. So first of all, I thought I should show you a little bit about Australia. I like to start with the good news, and there is some. I think it's quite important to note that Australians are living for longer. You will no doubt not be able to live this back there in the back of the room, but the top of the pile is Japan. Though my oldest son tells me a lot of them are actually dead and they just don't report it. Australia is second, which is pretty good, and we're gaining quite rapidly. And then United Kingdom and United States. And you can see there's this very nice increase. In fact, it's increased about 10 years over the past 50 years, which is quite an achievement. I think we should all be clapping ourselves on the back for that one. And it, of course, has some implications as well for diabetes, which I'll talk about later. And the other fascinating fact is that we're all growing taller in Australia too. And in fact, it's been about 1 centimetre a decade, which is quite substantial when you think about it, though it has started to tailor off. And I have a few pet theories about that, particularly with my children who are sort of curled over their laptops and iPads. And I think that's a similar story in North America as well. So that may have an effect. They don't get outside, they don't play as much, they're not getting as much sunshine. But overall, it's a good news story. The bad news, of course, well, I think you all have the impression that Australians are sort of tall, blonde Aussies. You see us in the movies and in your TV shows, you know, Nicole Kidman and Hugh Jackman. I think we look like that, but the reality, unfortunately, is more like that. And about 6 out of 10 Australian adults now are overweight or obese, which is pretty high, and we're about 21st in the sort of global ladder, if you like, so depending on which study you look at. And you can see here a comparison. So we've got United States, England and Canada, I guess, representing the main groups in the room today. You can see we are right up there, and it is increasing fairly rapidly. In fact, the rate of increase has been one of the most dramatic, I think, in the world. And of course, on its coattails, as we all have heard over the last couple of days, diabetes is going up along with it. I would argue, of course, it's also partly due to the increased lifespan. So that's a positive thing. And also, as we've heard over the last few days, that people with diabetes are actually managing their condition better and living for longer. So prevalence rates are going up for good reasons. It's not all bad news either, for that matter. Gestational diabetes is going up. That's the pink line at the bottom, even though it's hard to see on this scale. Type 1 is relatively stable in Australia. And of course, no surprises, the type 2 is the greatest growth area. And if we sum up those three, we work out there's about 1.5 million Australians with diabetes at the moment, which is a substantial amount given there's about 23 million Australians in the population. So it's about 8% of the population. Now, there was a study called AusDia back in the year 2000 that suggested that for every person with diagnosed diabetes, there was somebody else who had it and didn't know it, and that's this red line here. So there could be a lot more because of poor diagnosis. So is carbohydrate the villain? Like you, unfortunately, sugar phobia has come down under. We tend to inherit the fad diets from other parts of the world. This particular slide is rather close to Jennie and I's heart, which was focusing on sugar in particular. When the WHO draft guidelines came out over a year ago, now they got a lot of mention. Sorry, I'll go back to that. And particularly about the 5% draft guideline, but when they were released in final draft this year, got no media attention whatsoever, I might add, when it reinforced the 10%. And of course there's been that sugar film, which I think is probably coming to North America soon, which is, Super Size Me, but about sugar. Quite entertaining, but hopelessly mixed up. So there's certainly an awful lot about it. And of course, last but not least, the paleo diet is really big in Australia. And I did check out some of the local bookstores, and I know that it's big up here as well. So carbohydrates are really on the nose. What are Australians actually eating? I'm sure at the back you can't read that. So we've had 2 national nutrition surveys in Australia, one in 1995, which was about 14,000 people, representative sample of all Australians, and then 2011-12, about 12,000 people. Very similar method, 24-hour recall, standard sort of procedure. And you can see that protein intake has gone up mildly, slightly from 93 to 94 grams. Fat intake has actually gone down ever so slightly, as has total carbohydrate, and in particular total sugars and total starch. So, we really have, I think, followed the fads. We've followed the fat fad and we've been following the anti-carb fad. Dietary fibre, unfortunately, has gone down with it, which there's no real surprise there because we know that dietary fibre is mostly in carbohydrate-containing foods. And perhaps everybody's trying to drown their tears because they're all drinking more. So, are we eating too many carbohydrates? No. In fact, if you have seen the latest guidelines for what defines a high-carb diet, which is 45% of energy or more, Australians actually eat a moderate carbohydrate diet. I think there's the perception, we get a lot of media from North America, and I know you have a higher carbohydrate intake than us. We don't have a high carb intake. It's moderate, and it has been going down over the past 15 or so years. I've had a couple of master's students over the last semester, and they have very kindly looked at the average GI and GL of the Australian population, and in 2011-12 we estimate it's about 54.5, which appears to have gone down slightly. So when we last looked at it in about 2003, it was about 57. And I'd like to suggest that one of the reasons it's gone down a little bit is because of the efforts of our GI symbol program in Australia. Glycemic load is still relatively high, and you'll see there the guidelines that have been put together by various groups, including ours, is to, my pointer stopped working, there it is, to try and aim for 45. So we still need to lower the average population's dietary glycemic index by about 10 units, we believe, in order to get the glycemic load under the 100 unit mark. And I would argue certainly in Australia, to prevent any more adverse effects like decreasing fibre intake, we should be focusing on lowering the GI rather than lowering the GL. So that brings me on to the GI symbol program. It's a certification trademark. We first registered it in Australia and New Zealand in 2002. It has been registered in the United States and the European Union, and also a selection of Asian countries as well. And that's what it looks like. There are some specific criteria, and again, you probably can't read it at the back. So We do require them to meet the ISO, so they have to test to the ISO standard. And also, of course, they must be a source of carbohydrate. No low GI claims on bottles of water, thanks. And in addition to that, they must, of course, meet a variety of nutrition criteria, because when we started formulating the program back in the late 90s, you know, we were aware, of course, that chocolate had a low GI and didn't really think it was a good thing to be promoting it to people, not for everyday foods anyway. So we included criteria for kilojoules, for total carbs, for total and saturated fat, sodium, and in certain foods, dietary fibre and calcium. And these are very category specific, so each major food category has its own slightly different set of criteria. Here is one example. For obviously, and in most countries in the world, as I think we've heard again over the last few days, bread is the #1 source of glycemic carbohydrate. It still is in Australia as well. So yes, it must contain at least 10 grams of carb per serve. There are low-carb breads coming on the market in Australia, sad to say. It must have less than 5 grams of fat, or if it's more than that, less than 20% of that from saturated fats. Sorry, this is breakfast cereals, I don't know what I'm talking about. Too much jet lag. So very similar anyway. And there's an exemption here basically around the muesli type products, so Swiss mueslis, traditional mueslis, etc. Dietary fibre, 3 grams of fibre per 100 grams or more to make it a good source, and sodium 400 milligrams per 100 grams or less. And this model really does help identify the healthier choices within each food category. The bread category is very similar, and breakfast cereals is our #2 source of carbohydrate and glycemic load in Australia. Here's a selection of products that carry the logo. So basically in every major category of carbohydrate containing food, there is a product that carries the low GI symbol. And it's not just brand name products tucked away down in the corner here. We do have Australia's second largest supermarket chain that's part of the program, and some of their house brand or home brand products also carry the logo. So it's not just catering to the wealthy people. We're very pleased that it's also catering to people who obviously have less disposable income, the people that arguably need it the most. In addition to our GI symbol program, there is, of course, a provision within our food standards for generic low GI claims, and I'll go through those now. But in order to do so, I need to give a bit of the backstory, and I think Tom's already touched on some of the story this morning. We actually approached Standards Australia way back in 2003 to develop an Australian standard, and we convened a working party in 2004. There were scientists from the GI Foundation, also from the Commonwealth Scientific Investigation and Research Organisation, as the name suggests, a government scientific research organisation, and Australia's Food and Grocery Council. So industry, government and not-for-profit were involved, and also Food Standards Australia and New Zealand had an involvement as well. As you can see, it took a few years and many meetings to get the Australian standard gazetted, and then it took, after that had been gazetted, it actually took another 5 or 6 years and about 70 meetings, I might add, to develop the international standard. So, and of course, that was a far more global project and involved many of the scientists, in fact, that are in this room today, which is really good, and I'm very pleased with the results that Thomas showed this morning, which makes it all feel worthwhile, because at the time it was a bit laborious. Now, of course, in parallel with that, and not entirely coincidentally, the new nutrition, health and related claim legislation was being discussed and debated, and basically this was looking to make higher level health claims like you have in North America and some other parts of the world. But in relation to some of those claims, of course, the glycemic index and load were mentioned, and in particular some members suggested that they should be included as nutrition content claims rather than function claims or higher level health claims, and I think there'll be a bit more discussion of that later, because most of the scientists in Australia consider the glycemic index or load to be a property of the food of itself rather than relating to specific health outcomes. And they deliberately decided not to describe the method in the draft, they just refer to the Australian standard. So to make generic health claims in Australia, you have to comply with the Australian standard, unlike the GI symbol program, which requires ISO. Now, this is what it looks like in the end. So again, you can see it takes a long time to go down this path. So 2013 was when this legislation, so nearly 10 years later, was finally gazetted, and they've defined glycemic index, which you can probably read quite well back there. So glycemic index means the property of the carbohydrates in different foods, specifically the blood glucose raising ability of the digestible carbohydrates in a given food. So a pretty simple and quite clear definition of what it means. And then they recommend there's a nutrition profile scoring system, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute, that it must meet that. And also it defines low, medium and high GI. Now they're actually defined in the Australian standard and in the international standard as well, but it is also reiterated in the Food Standards Code. So there is no confusion as to what low, medium and high means. And this is the Food Standards Australia, New Zealand Nutrition Profiling Scoring Calculator. You can see it's actually very similar, though it came, I might add, many, many years later to ours. Kilojoule saturated fats. It includes total sugars, which is offset by credits for dairy foods and fruit, and sodium, and then protein and dietary fibre. And in fact, when we compare the two models, they produce essentially the same results. The correlation is over 0.9 between the two models, which is great news from our perspective, given that we were preceding them in its development. And here's an example of a food. You probably can't see that at the back, but it says in fairly small print here, low GI, high in fibre, naturally sweetened with honey. So not quite as conspicuous as the GI symbol, of course. What is the consumer experience? We did a whole series of consumer research studies from the time that we launched in Australia. In fact, just prior to the launch, we launched in July, we did a baseline study, and we did a whole series up to 2012, all much the same. You'll recognise some of the companies, Newspol and AC Nelson, no doubt. So large, reputable research companies that were independent from us conducted the research in all of the Australian mainland capital cities, random samples of adults, and basically we had pretty similar questions throughout most of those years overall. And you can see in the last one in this series, it was about 1,500 Australians, and again, it was a representative sample. Now, from these studies, we found, in fact, after about 3 years of launching, the consumer awareness went up to about 8 out of 10 Australians and remained and has remained that way ever since, which is pretty quick when you think about it. And but you can probably see down this blue box here, back in 2002, awareness was about 28%. So there was a very rapid increase in consumer awareness of GI over a relatively short period of time. So even if that's the case in your own country at the moment, if awareness is fairly low, it can increase fairly rapidly over a short period of time through appropriate marketing and public relations activities. 70% of those who are aware of it understand it's about blood sugars or blood glucose and energy, which is great. And around about 70%, 7 out of 10, suggest that they're going to use it when they're choosing food. Now, the awareness is greatest amongst females. That is kind of deliberate, so most of our marketing activities have focused on particularly young and middle-aged women of childbearing age for a whole variety of reasons. You can see the 25 to 39-year-old age group in particular. But there is another bounce, of course, in those who are over 50, when, of course, diabetes starts to become an issue. So diabetes in Australia starts to go up after about age 45 years. So when you've got diabetes, obviously you learn more about carbohydrates, and glycemic index is certainly taught by diabetes educators and dietitians in Australia. And as far as that was awareness, but what do they actually understand? I think this is equally important. And the main messages that about 8 out of 10 of them understand is that it provides sustained energy or sustained release of glucose, if you like. I might add that this most recent research was after Diogenes was published, which got a lot of publicity in Australia, and certainly there was a good understanding with respect to weight loss and long-term or longer-term weight management. And then good for general children's health and well-being. Again, a lot of the studies around cognition were publicised in Australian media around that time, so that's where that links in. And then useful for exercise endurance for increased performance. And really the evidence is relevant to all life stages across the community. Now, the GI symbol itself, so that was GI in general. The GI symbol itself, I might add that we did change, oops, sorry, okay, I need to speed up. We changed from an older version to a newer version, and you can see it was 37%, so nearly 4 out of 10 Australians were aware of it. And most of those people that are aware of it, 80% of them realise that it's healthy, wholesome and a good choice. It's scientifically tested and provides sustained energy and glucose release. And of course, we're very happy with all of those messages. And I think it's my last slide. Consumer research, the most recent consumer research focused more on some subgroups, and in particular relevance for this audience is the diabetes group. And awareness of GI in general was about 6 out of 10, and for the GI symbol about 5 out of 10 amongst that group, from a representative sample from around Australia. And in general, people with type 2 diabetes look for low GI, whole grain and high fibre claims. And for those who are aware of the low GI claims, 81% of them look for the GI symbol. So they're very loyal. People with diabetes that are aware of GI are very loyal to the GI symbol. I might skip over that one for the sake of time. So in summary, I believe that we need a global food and nutrition strategy to address the diabetes epidemic. Decreasing the average dietary glycemic index and load, I think, can be part of that strategy. And I think in Australia we've demonstrated quite clearly that it is possible to identify and promote healthy low GI foods to the general population. It can be done. The GI Foundation and its GI symbol has worked down under, and it's ready to be rolled out globally. So happy to discuss that with you later in the breaks. And thank you for listening.
What we will like to talk to you about today is the scientific advice that EFSA is providing to the Commission and the Member States regarding carbohydrates and carbohydrate-containing foods, in which context this advice is given, and mostly how it's used by risk managers of the Commission and the Member States, which, in Europe, these two parts are quite separated. So how they are using the advice EFSA is providing them in order to make legislation for food labeling, but also to set nutrition goals for each member state, food-based dietary guidelines and nutrition recommendations for the population. So all this scientific assessment is done by the NDA panel that has 21 members, and that also provides advice on novel foods. This is about safety, pure safety. Also about infant formula, dietetic foods, upper levels of intake, vitamins and minerals, and food allergens for labeling. So I'm going to talk today about dietary reference values and health claims, starting with DRVs for carbohydrates and dietary fiber. In 2010, EFSA provided advice on DRVs for glycemic carbohydrates and dietary fiber for the European population. These are DRVs, are not nutrition goals, not food-based dietary guidelines, are not nutrition recommendations. So for total glycemic carbohydrates, the advice was based on the fact that low-carb, high-fat diets, we heard that in the first presentation today, consumed at libitum are associated with an increase in body weight, but the data was insufficient to set a lower threshold of intake for carbohydrates on this basis. There is also the fact that high-carb diets adversely affect lipid profile. We're talking about 75% of energy from carbohydrates or more. And then there also the data was insufficient to set a total upper level of intake for carbohydrates. So EFSA established a reference intake range for carbohydrates going to 45% to 60% of the energy, the total energy. And that was based on the fact that these diets, in combination with reduced intakes of fat and saturated fatty acids, are compatible with the improvement of metabolic risk factors for chronic disease, as well as with mean carbohydrate intakes observed in some European countries. The advice on sugars, also this one was based on the fact that frequent consumption of sugar-containing foods increase the risk of dental caries, especially when prophylactic measures were insufficient. But the available data really was not enough to set an upper level for sugar intake, Also because the risk for caries was not only based on the amount of sugar consumed. On the other hand, there was also some evidence that high intakes of sugars in the form of sugar-sweet beverage could contribute to weight gain. But again, the evidence was not enough to set an upper level for sugars. So EFSA didn't establish any DRB for sugars, but asked member states to consider that these facts should be considered when establishing nutrition goals for populations and recommendations for individuals and for setting food-based dietary guidelines at national level. Regarding dietary fiber, the 25 grams per day DRB was based on the raw fiber model function, but there was also acknowledged that in adults, higher intakes of fiber were positively associated negatively associated, with the risk of coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes and weight maintenance, and probably this could also be taken into account to establish food-based dietary guidelines. Regarding the glycemic index and glycemic load of foods, there was some support for a role of GI and GL in the treatment of type 2 diabetes, and some evidence suggesting that lowering GI and GL may have favorable effects on some metabolic risk factors, such as serum lipids, but the evidence regarding their role in the prevention of diet-related diseases in the general healthy population, but that is the target population for DRBs, was still inconclusive. And I want to remind you that these DRBs for carbohydrates and dairy fibers were set in 2010. So another area in which EFSA is giving advice regarding carbohydrates, carbohydrate-containing foods, is in the area of nutrition and health claims under the European regulation. I want to remind you that the all claims in Europe need pre-authorization since the regulation entered into force in 2006. But the regulation was already approved with an annex that is listing a series of nutrient claims that are authorized for use in Europe. That annex is a live document, let's say, can be modified at any time upon request of the Commission and Member States after EFSA's advice. That was the case for the claims on rich in omega-3 fatty acids and the claims like, no cholesterol, rich in lycopene, and also low GI are forbidden in Europe at the moment. That could change in the future, and we can discuss later in the panel why this is so. Then, also in the context of function claims, there have been requests for claims on the reduction of postprandial glycemic responses, but also on long-term blood glucose control. And then there have been some, very few, I must say, that remember only one application for a health claim on the reduction of the risk of disease, in this case, and the reduction of the risk of type 2 diabetes. But of course, these claims are only authorized in Europe if they refer directly to a risk factor for disease and not to the disease itself, like lowering either fasting or postprandial glycemic responses during an OGTT. So EFSA is quite flexible in regarding the risk factor if the evidence between the intake of the food and the reduction of the risk of disease is established. Then the risk factor can be worked out in the, because that is a regulatory requirement, but of course is from a scientific point of view, the hardest evidence you can have is a reduction in the risk of disease, actually. So we're trying to just reconcile the legislation with the scientific evidence as much as we can. For the scientific and evaluation of health claims, in general, EFSA needs to ask three main questions. Is asking to the applicants three main questions: whether the food constituent is defined and characterized, whether the claimed effect is defined and is a physiological a beneficial physiological effect, and whether a cause and effect relationship is established between the consumption of the food and the claimed effect, but also for the target group under the conditions of use. So there are a lot of constraints to get a positive evaluation for health claims in this area. I also want to remind you that claims on disease populations, health claims on food, some disease populations are forbidden in Europe. Those are medicinal claims. So even if the patients cannot be the target group for health claim, studies in patients could be used for the scientific substantiation of health claims for the general population in certain circumstances. So it's up to the applicant to define the circumstances in which this could be made, but it's assessed on a case-by-case basis. But for example, the answer would be generally yes for the study subjects are diabetic patients treated with lifestyle measures only, diet and physical activity. Also yes for diabetic patients under medication when there is evidence for a lack of interaction between the mechanism of action of the food and that of the drug on the claimed effect. And the answer would be no when there is a lack of that evidence. So EFSA conclusions can be yes or no. Even if here you have 3 different conclusions in EFSA opinions, yes is cause and effect has been established, no is both insufficient evidence and not established. But we thought splitting the no could give more advice to the industry about the amount and the type of scientific evidence that was missing in order to get a positive opinion from EFSA. So these claims, the function claims, have been submitted under the Article 13.1 list. I must say that the process for the evaluation of those claims was not really very well defined in Europe. There was no possible dialogue with the applicant. The EFSA didn't even know who was the applicant for those claims. There were a large number of claims covered by EFSA in a very short period of time, so we couldn't look at all of them at the same time. Just, it was a learning process also for EFSA. And generally, there was poor quality of the information provided, also because this clustering of the claims that was done at the commission level was distorting a little the type of claims that the industry was provided. So I think it was a learning process for everybody. But then we have the health claim applications under Article 13.5. And here the process is really very well defined. Dialogue with the applicant is possible through clock stop letters, phone calls during the evaluation process. The opinions were, we have legal deadlines for the adoption of the opinions. And the drawback, I think, is that this was meant to be a fast-track procedure, and industry was very interested in that. But then the legal constraint is that industry needs to provide any additional evidence that is requested by EFSA within 15 days. And that's getting a very difficult part of the process, I will say, for the industry. So we have 3 types of food constituents for which claims on the production of postprandial glucose responses have been applied for. The first one are food constituents that, when added to carbohydrate-containing foods, could reduce the postprandial blood glucose responses. So here, there is an equal content of available carbohydrates in the test and in the control food. That is what we call the constituent will have an independent effect on the claim. Second, we had claims on food constituents that, when replacing carbohydrates that are known to increase blood glucose, then will reduce blood glucose responses, and that is a replacement effect. So I'm replacing glycemic carbohydrates by non-glycemic carbohydrates, or digestible carbohydrates by non-digestible carbohydrates. So that's a very easy claim. And then we have claims where that were on the property of digestible carbohydrates. So also here, equal content of carbohydrates, of available carbohydrates in the test and the control foods. An example for this is the claims on the slow digestible starch. An example for case 2 are intense sweeteners, sugar alcohols, dietary fiber. And also an example for the third one was dietary fiber, not when it's replacing glycemic carbohydrates, but when it's added to glycemic carbohydrates. Here, only for your information, you have the real food constituents that for which health claims have been requested in Europe. You have in orange the ones with a positive outcome, in purple the ones with a negative outcome. I'm not going to go through that, but I guess the presentation will be available to you. And here are the same for food constituents submitted in health claims applications under Article 13.5. Why so many unfavorable opinions from EFSA for these claims? There are many, many reasons, but some of them are here in the slides for you to think about. One main reason was that the food was not sufficiently described in these claims for a scientific assessment. That includes dietary fiber in general. Different types of fibers may have different effects, which you don't need to do to establish DRBs, but yes, for health claims. Low GI, low GL carbohydrates. It was really very poorly described what was that. You know, different applicants have different ideas, and these claims go all together to EFSA, so it was not possible to sort that out. Then, of course, there is another issue, is whether evidence is provided that the claim is a beneficial physiological effect. We have some claims on amino acids and protein hydrogenates, increasing insulin secretion, and no evidence was provided that why that was a beneficial physiological effect for the general population and not for diabetics. And then, of course, in many circumstances, the human studies that were provided were not supporting the claim. Well, sometimes there were no human studies at all, but in some other cases, there were a lot of methodological flaws in the studies provided. Some human studies were not provided on insulinemic responses, for example, and some others were justly done in patients under medication with no rationale why that should also work in healthy people. And only my last slide, very quickly, just reminding you the gap that is between the scientific assessment and of a health claim, a positive assessment, and the authorization of that claim in the European market. So there are many things that risk managers need to consider after the EFSA opinion is published until they authorize the claim. And some of them are depicted in this slide. They need to consider that claims cannot imply that food is unsafe. And the wording of some claims can imply that. For example, claims like sugar increases blood glucose responses, replacing sugar by X helps maintain a normal glycemia, for example. So that may imply that sugars are unsafe, and that is forbidden in the legislation. They need to consider as well whether a claim may lead to excessive consumption of a food. They need to consider safety aspects which are not assessed in the context of health claims by EFSA, because in the health claims regulation, food is safe, and then it does not include a safety assessment. So they can ask in the second step for that assessment to EFSA. Claims cannot refer to a property that is common for all foods. For example, reduces glycemic responses compared to glucose. It may be true for almost virtually all foods. Okay? The feasibility of implementation, how enforcement authorities can check whether the properties of the food match the label, and also consumer understanding. The wording for health claims that EFSA gives is scientifically based and does not take into account consumer understanding. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Silvia. That's excellent.
Thank you for inviting CDA to be here. It really is our pleasure to be able to be a part of the panel and also have other levels of presentation here at this meeting, and especially for CDA to be the publisher of world-renowned clinical practice guidelines wherein we have a low glycemic recommendations within the nutrition chapter of our guidelines. We're really pleased to be here to hear all of the presentations from our colleagues and also to be the organization that continues to invest and also investigate how glycemic index can best help Canadians living with diabetes and Canadians as a whole.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's tremendous. Shall we open it? I'm going to share it with Jennie. We share this. I'm precariously perched on the edge there. Just trying to keep me from literally falling off the edge. In which case, she will take over. So if anyone doesn't like me, just get me to go in that direction. But perhaps we would have, I think, some discussion and some questions from the floor, I think, would be good at this particular point in time. Sorry.
Thank you. Saul Katz from Solo GI Nutrition, Solo Bars. In 2006, we filed with Health Canada for low glycemic claims. So we're very pleased that finally we have the opportunity to get recognition for all the fine work that the both of you have done for so many years and for your perseverance, so thank you for that. Jennie, maybe a question to you. As we're embarking on this low glycemic claim opportunity in Canada, how can we best educate consumers about the benefits of low glycemic generally and for people with diabetes?
Well, what I choose to do as a scientist and an academic is always respond to journalists quickly, promptly. I'm willing to do interviews, telephone, print, you name it. I think we have an important role as scientists to make sure that messages that are conveyed to the public are reliable and accurate. If we're too busy and we don't want to do that, then it means you give double time to the people out there who really are not experts in your field. So I would recommend that people, scientists here, be willing to do that. After all, most of us are paid by the taxpayer, and we have a moral obligation, I think, to do those things. So the Symbol program in Australia has played a really important role as a non-for-profit that promotes a scientific message about healthy, low GI foods. Don't leave it to the market forces. Take control right from the start, and I commend the Canadian Diabetes Association for the decision they've made. I think it's a proactive decision, and you know, if you think back at how we didn't handle the low-fat claims very well, they went on jelly beans, and we need to take control now, and this is the best step forward, an education program.
Can I add to that from a practical perspective? So I mentioned in my presentation that Diabetes Australia and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation of Australia were involved. And in the mid-90s, they started including information about the GI in their consumer magazines. So we were talking to the members, and the membership of Diabetes Australia through the National Diabetes Services Scheme is very large as a proportion of the community. So we're educating about carbohydrates in general, talking about the different components of carbohydrate and glycemic index as a part of that. And we don't obsess around numbers. I think there's a tendency I've picked up from some of the diabetes conferences to talk about, lowering, choosing a food with a GI 54 versus a 53 or something like that. We don't focus on the numbers. We simply label foods low GI, and we use the swap it, don't stop it approach. And I think we had a lot of discussion about cultural appropriateness and different diets that work. All we are telling people to do is to choose a healthy low GI choice within a food category as the GI was originally conceived around the carbohydrate exchange system. So really using it within that framework, which most people are familiar with anyway, and simply choosing the lower GI choice. So it's very easy to do so, and that's why awareness and understanding has improved very, very substantially. It can be done.
Bernard Venn, the University of Otago in New Zealand. I'd like to address my question to Silvia, please, but perhaps the panel would also like to respond. Fructose has a low GI, as Alfred has told us, and yet EFSA have allowed a health claim when fructose partially replaces sucrose in a food or a beverage. And there are major concerns around the consumption of fructose, particularly in North America. So I'd just like to have your opinion, please, as to what you think the ramifications might be of allowing a health claim increasing the fructose intake in the population?
I'm very pleased about this question because this is becoming really an issue in Europe. The scientific opinion said replacing glucose or sucrose by fructose decreases glycemic responses, which is scientifically true. There is very little discussion about that. Yeah. Then, as I said, the evaluation is the health claims evaluation is not about safety, but EFSA can comment on possible restrictions of use. And there was a comment saying that it has been observed that very high intakes of fructose may have some health consequences. So it was noted in the opinion. There was a message to risk managers to consider whether to authorize the claim or not, and under which conditions to do so. The Commission of Member States decided to authorize the claim. It's an authorized claim in Europe now, and there has been a lot of reactions in respect to that claim from the media. We got a lot of questions from stakeholders, from the media, from consumer organizations, and now the latest news is nothing certain, but what could happen, you asked for my opinion, this is my opinion, what could happen is that the Commission sends EFSA a mandate to assess the safety of fructose. That could be one thing. We saw that already for some claims on caffeine and increasing physical performance, attention, concentration, etc. In the authorization process, member states had concerns about the safety of caffeine, and then before authorizing anything, they sent EFSA a question regarding the safety of caffeine, also in consumption within energy drinks, alcohol, and other in combination with physical exercise. This time, risk managers may decide to send the question post-authorization. They can always do that.
Can I add?
Just a quick word. We have John at the back. I don't know, John, would you want to make a comment here? I know John and I have been talking quite often about how healthy foods that may be high fiber may have increased amounts of fructose in them with high fiber and high volume, and actually may have a benefit. John, do you want to say a few words?
All I would say is we've published a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses on this question, and I don't want to take any more time away. You can read those, and we can have a discussion about that this afternoon, because we're going to have a session on sweeteners, and Luke Tappy's going to talk about fructose, and I'm very happy to provide feedback then, but I don't want to take away from the glycemic index discussion we're having right now. So let's save that for this afternoon's session.
Good. John's going to save that for this afternoon. Thank you.
David, can I comment on that from a practical perspective? It's Alan over here.
Please, yes.
Just in case you are thinking, or Bernard is implying, that people will be adding fructose to foods, or companies will, to lower the GI and make claims, both the nutrition profiling model of the GI Foundation and FSANZ, of course, have fibre criteria and energy criteria, which will somewhat limit that possibility from happening. And certainly in Australia, we have not seen the addition of fructose to foods to make low GI claims in the real world.
Hi, Dave Miller, Unilever, the Netherlands. I guess this is a question to Alan, but others might address it as well. I was slightly surprised to see endorsement of sustained energy as an interpretation or a claim that could be associated with low GI. I'm not really sure where that comes from. First of all, the blood glucose responses, one would say, is not a substantiation of that, but in most cases, lower GI is a completely lower blood glucose response. You don't see an extended response, you usually see a lower response. Also, very few products actually test for sustained release of energy or sustained rate of absorption of the energy. And also, as has been discussed, there is the possibility to add ingredients or have compositions which specifically raise insulin levels and therefore would further decrease the slope of that curve, or the descending slope of the curve. So, is this really the right message to give to consumers? Is this substantiated?
That wasn't a message that was given to consumers. That was consumer research as to what their understanding of the health benefits of GI. That was one of their main understandings of what the health benefits were of GI. With respect to the substantiation, we actually have done a systematic literature review and meta-analysis of studies looking at physical performance. So sustained physical performance, there is actually a 20% increase in physical performance in endurance activities, which we consider to be quite good quality evidence to support that claim anyway. And I could show that to you later if you wish.
So in that case, then you're saying that the substantiation of sustained energy is physical performance?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Last question.
Fred Browns, Maastricht University. Alan, you say that is what consumers understand, sustained energy, but consumers don't understand GI. So if they understand sustained energy, somebody has told them. And I remember having seen packaging in Australia with cornflakes where you see the curves, and then the low GI curve is equivalent to sustained energy. It's written on the package. So I believe that's communication, and that's not merely an understanding. That's the way industry goes. And personally, I have big problems with the term sustained energy because it doesn't exist. It's simply, it is marketing, just like the word superfoods is marketing. Sustained energy doesn't exist. A cell does not decide what type of energy is slow or fast. The cell uses ATP independent of what rate it is absorbed or it comes to the cell or whatever. And sustained energy in the mind of the consumer, if you want to measure what it is, can be a psychological feeling. I do not have the dip in the afternoon, so I have energy. It can be in the gut that you say, I want to look at the rate of absorption, and then something is slower absorbed, and then you can say, well, slow release is sustained energy. So I fully agree with the previous question that sustained energy is a very difficult thing, and I think in terms of regulations, for my perception, this is a no-go.
From our perspective, of course, we weren't promoting those claims as such. We simply put the label on with the GI symbol and the value. But certainly that's the consumer understanding, as I said, and we have substantiated that with respect to sustained physical activity. And it is a quite large, both clinically and statistically significant improvement in sustained physical performance. And I'm happy to show that to you later. Fred?
Let's come down on the energy drinks, right, which are just caffeine and they make people feel better. So as far as I'm concerned, low GI makes you feel better, then you have sustained energy.
I was just going to weigh in quickly and say I agree with the sustained energy thing is not a thing that I would want to see. But in defense, I would say that if one takes foods that are slow release, such as lentils, which are lente carbohydrate in its extreme form, you will find you get a good second meal effect. You don't get a counter-regulatory response at 4 hours, which you often do with more refined carbohydrates. You get lower glucagon and lower catecholamine secretion than you do with a large meal of more refined carbohydrate. So, and you get an improved second meal effect. So, I mean, I'm not making a plea for retaining sustained energy, but I am saying that it's an interesting concept, and I think that perhaps the discussion it needs to be a bit more broad than we've had right now. And so I think so broad that I think we need lunch to have any further discussion. So I'd like to thank all our speakers and panelists and all of those of you who asked questions. Thank you very much.